You wake to the chill of stone beneath your bare feet, the flickering torchlight painting jagged shadows across the damp walls. The tapestries that hang there, worn, faded, their threads thick with centuries of dust, do little to soften the room's menace. A scent lingers in the air, something sharp and sour. Smoke, damp wool, the metallic tang. Of iron, you are 12 years old. Your limbs are still slender as reeds, your body unready for what lies ahead. Yet tonight you do not stand as a child. You stand as a bride. The gown they have wrapped you in scratches like a hair. Shirt the brocade stiff, its embroidery gleaming like trapped moonlight. Each thread a promise, each jewel on your veil a chain. You are wrapped in power, but not your own. Beneath the heavy folds, your skin prickles with fear. Your pulse hammers, a relentless blacksmith's forge echoing in the silence. Then the door creaks. The sound is long and drawn, like the groan of the earth itself. A man steps inside, twice your age, his figure blocking the glow of the torches in the hallway. His breath carries the sourness of wine, heavy from the feast below. His eyes, shadowed not only by the flicker of flame, but by the crushing expectations of kingdoms. This is no dream of love. This is no romance whispered by minstrels. Tonight is your wedding night, and the serpent of dread coils deep in your stomach. For you know what awaits. Your innocence must become a seal, an oath written not on parchment, but upon your own body. Your small frame, your fragile womb transformed into the vessel for heirs yet unborn. Failure is not an option. Failure means annulment, disgrace, or worse. It means being cast aside, left to rot in obscurity, or claimed by death in childbed, as so many women are, their screams swallowed by stone walls, their blood seeping into rushes laid on the floor. In the dim light of a single tallow candle sputtering against drafts that creep through cracks in ancient mortar, history holds its breath. For what is about to unfold here in this chamber is not merely personal, it is political. Entire dynasties rise and fall on what happens in the silence between two strangers in a bed curtained with velvet. And so begins our journey into these hidden histories, where wedding nights were not tales of tenderness but of survival. Nights where fear was the uninvited guest, where girlhood ended at the edge of a marriage bed, and where crowns were forged in the furnace of duty. If you enjoy learning about the buried truths of history, stories of human cost behind gilded crowns, consider joining us as we trace these forgotten paths. Because tonight, we will step into the shadows of medieval chambers, into the lives of queens who were once children, into the terror and resilience that echo still through the centuries. In the flicker of candlelight, she looks no different from any child, her small hands clutching the edge of a wooden chest carved with imperial eagles, her eyes darting between shadows as if searching for a way to escape them. Yet this girl, Matilda, carries a destiny not of her choosing. Born around 1102 in the royal court of England, her cradle rocked not by lullabies but by the weight of politics. She was the daughter of King Henry I, a man whose gaze could turn affection into calculation, who saw in his offspring not family but bargaining chips. From the moment of her birth, Matilda's life was never her own. She was not raised for herself but for a future alliance. Her laughter in the palace halls, her faltering steps across flagstones, her first words, these were watched, measured, and quietly marked for the currency they could one day bring. For in the brutal arithmetic of medieval Europe, daughters were pawns on the chessboard of power. By 1109, when she was no more than 7, the first move had already been played. Envoys arrived from the Holy Roman Empire, their cloaks still carrying the scent of foreign smoke and snow. They came not with swords but with parchment, bearing a proposal from Emperor Henry V, ruler of a vast domain stretching across Germany and Italy. He was a man hardened by campaigns, ambitious, and ever hungry to expand his influence. In Matilda he saw not a child, but the thread that might bind his empire to England's throne. The betrothal was sealed in Utrecht on April 10, 1110. Imagine it, a solemn ceremony in a cathedral thick with incense, the voices of clergy echoing through vaulted stone, Latin words of eternal promise spoken over a child barely old enough to braid her own hair. To Henry I, it was a triumph, a daughter secured to the most powerful ruler in Christendom. To the emperor, it was a binding rope, one more strand in the tapestry of his dominion. To Matilda, it was the end of her childhood, and so, before she had seen her 12th summer, she was dispatched across the Channel, leaving behind the mists of Normandy and England for the iron heart of Germany. The journey itself must have seemed endless. The rolling seas, the dark forests looming like watchmen over winding rivers, the unfamiliar clang of blacksmiths hammering weapons in distant towns. Every step carried her farther from the safety of the court she knew, deeper into a life where her body and her would be claimed by strangers. Placed under the guardianship of Archbishop Bruno of Trier, Matilda was groomed for her role as Empress. She learned the guttural tones of German, the precise elegance of Latin, the strict postures of court etiquette. Her days were filled with lessons, reciting prayers before stern-faced clerics, tracing stitches of silk under the gaze of ladies-in-waiting, bowing just so before noblemen who appraised her, as one appraises a prized horse. But beneath this training a quiet dread must have grown. Even when she pressed her lips against the cold marble of chapel saints, whispering private prayers, what comfort could she find? How could a child comprehend what it meant to be a wife, not in affection but in obligation? For matrimony was no sanctuary. It was a contract of flesh, and the consummation would be observed, confirmed, recorded. There was no escape, no privacy, no refusal. The chronicles speak in cold terms of treaties and dowries, of titles and lands. They do not record the heartbeat of a girl as she knelt at her prayers, imagining the life that awaited her. They do not record the silent terror that coils in a young chest when she realizes that her body has become the battlefield upon which empires stake their claims. And yet this was the fate of Matilda, the pawn of a king, promised to an emperor. Her path had already been chosen. What remained was the crossing into womanhood, and the long shadow of a wedding night she could neither understand nor escape. The year was 1110. Matilda was 8 years old, an age when most children still chase birds through gardens or fall asleep clutching a wooden doll. Yet for her there was no play, no softness left. Her father had made the decision. She would leave England, leave her mother, leave every familiar voice behind, and cross the sea into a land that did not speak her tongue. The departure itself was more spectacle than farewell. Chroniclers tell of envoys, knights, and attendants gathered to escort the child bride to her new world. To them this was ceremony, the visible proof of an alliance. To Matilda it must have been terror dressed in silks. She boarded the ship with the North Sea heaving beneath her, the salty air stinging her face, knowing each gust of wind carried her farther from home. For days, perhaps weeks, the procession wound its way through foreign landscapes, first the stormy coasts, then the great rivers of the empire. Imagine the sight. Dense German forests rising like walls of shadow on either side, the air thick with pine and smoke from distant hearths. Villages stared as the English princess passed, her carriage guarded by armored riders whose banners bore the black eagle of the empire. And then, at last, the imperial court. To Matilda's young eyes, it must have been overwhelming. Vaulted halls heavy with incense and stone, the clang of armor echoing through chambers, strange voices uttering guttural words she struggled to understand. Here she was no longer daughter, no longer child. She was property transferred from one sovereign to another. Her new guardian, Archbishop Bruno of Trier, took charge of her education. He was a strict man, shaped by the discipline of the church. Under his guidance, Matilda's days became a relentless routine, lessons in Latin scripture, instruction in imperial ceremony, the stern correction of her German tutors. She was taught how to walk with regal gravity, how to lower her eyes in measured submission, how to hide the tremor in her hands when noblemen inspected her. To the Emperor Henry V, she was still years away from womanhood, but that mattered little. What mattered was control. Even before she became his wife, she was molded into an instrument of empire. The imperial court was not a nursery, it was a forge, and Matilda was iron to be hammered into shape. But she was still a child. And at night, when the torches burned low and the courtiers' voices faded, she must have felt the absence most keenly. No mother to tuck her into bed. No familiar lullaby. Only the stone walls, the crucifix above her chamber, and the distant toll of bells marking time in a world that was no longer hers. The chronicles are silent about her tears. They do not tell us whether she prayed for England, whether she whispered her mother's name into her pillow. They do not say whether in the stillness she dared to imagine running away. What they do tell us is this: she did not resist. She endured. For that, even at 8 years old, she was already becoming something more than pawn. She was becoming steel. In 1114, the great halls of Mainz resounded with celebration. Bells rang from cathedral towers, their echoes rolling across the river like thunder. Torches blazed against the night sky, casting flickering light upon banners bearing the eagle of the empire. It was the wedding day of Henry V, Holy Roman Emperor, and his bride, Matilda of England. She was 12 years old. The chronicles describe the magnificence of the event: 1,000 nobles in jeweled finery, golden chalices overflowing with wine, choirs chanting Latin hymns beneath soaring arches of stone. To the lords and clergy gathered there, this was not a marriage of hearts, but of realms. England and the Empire, bound together by a girl scarcely old enough to understand the words she was compelled to speak. Henry was 24, hardened by war and politics, a man of iron will and ruthless calculation. He had already deposed one pope, marched armies across the Alps, and broken rebellions with merciless resolve. To him, Matilda was not a bride in the tender sense. She was a seal, a guarantee, a symbol of legitimacy to wield in the endless game of power. The vows were spoken, the rings exchanged. Latin words fell heavy into the cathedral air, words Matilda repeated in obedience, though their meaning lay far beyond her comprehension. She stood dressed in silks, her hair braided and veiled, her eyes lowered as she was handed to a man twice her age. The applause of the court thundered around her, but for the girl at the center there was no triumph, only surrender. And then came the darker truth of medieval matrimony, consummation. For the union to be binding, it had to be sealed not in prayer, but in flesh. This was not whispered, not private. It was known, expected, and in some courts even witnessed. The chroniclers, with chilling detachment, record only that the marriage was completed. They do not tell us whether Matilda trembled as the torches were dimmed, whether she prayed as the emperor approached, whether she clenched her eyes shut to block out the world. Here is the silence of history, the silence where a child's terror is swallowed by the grandeur of empire. In the years that followed, Matilda bore the title Empress. She sat beside Henry in state processions, glittering in jewels, her face composed into the regal mask demanded of her. Courtiers bowed, peasants gazed in awe, chroniclers inked her name into the annals of Christendom. Yet beneath the crown she remained what she had always been, a girl pressed into a role carved by the ambitions of men. Still, even in those early years, something unbroken remained within her. She absorbed the ways of the court, mastered its rituals, and watched with sharp, quiet eyes. If Henry believed he had married a pawn, he would one day learn that the child he claimed was no mere piece on the board. But for now, she was 12, and she belonged to him. In the months after her marriage, Matilda's world narrowed to the rigid rhythms of the imperial court. Her days were choreographed, prayers at dawn, audiences at noon, banquets by torchlight. She walked always a half step behind the emperor, her presence both ceremonial and symbolic. She was no longer simply a girl, she was empress. But the crown upon her head was not merely ornament, it was instruction. Every gesture, every word was scrutinized. She was expected to embody the majesty of the Holy Roman Empire, to stand as its jewel before kings and bishops, nobles and commoners alike. The empress did not stumble. The empress did not falter. And so Matilda learned. She learned the weight of silence in council chambers, where bishops debated in Latin and German knights thundered their loyalties. She learned when to incline her head in deference, when to meet a gaze with steel, when to soften her voice into honey. At banquets she became the mirror of imperial splendor, her robes heavy with embroidery, her hands steady as she lifted the golden chalice. In time, she mastered the languages of power. Latin became her tongue of diplomacy, German her tongue of command, French her tongue of birthright. Letters began to bear her seal, addressed to abbots and abbesses, nobles and monasteries. In her handwriting we see not the uncertain scrawl of a child, but the clear, deliberate lines of authority. Henry V, for all his ruthlessness, recognized her value. When he marched to Italy to confront the papacy, Matilda was at his side, riding beneath the imperial banners. She entered Rome not as a bride hidden in the shadow of her husband, but as an empress enthroned in majesty. Chroniclers record how she presided over ceremonies, received envoys, and gave judgments with the poise of one far beyond her years. And yet, this was no fairy tale. The imperial court was a crucible of suspicion and rivalry. Noblewomen whispered of her youth, German lords eyed her foreign blood, clerics muttered at her father's reputation as the usurper of England. To many, she remained the outsider, the English child bound to an emperor's bed. But Matilda endured. More than that, she adapted. Every cold glance was a lesson. Every whispered slight was armor. By the time she reached her 15th year, she no longer resembled the frightened child who had crossed the sea. She had become a figure of presence, a young woman who carried herself with the poise of one who understood both the cruelty of fate and the necessity of survival. The chronicles that survive call her Domina Imperatrix, the Lady Empress. It is a title that carried weight not just in ceremony but in law. She was recognized across Christendom as consort of the emperor, equal in title if not in power. And for the first time she began to glimpse a truth that would define her life. She was no pawn. She could be a player. But the empire was fragile, its alliances brittle, its emperor restless. Henry Vitica's ambitions would drive him into endless conflict, into battles against popes and princes alike. And wherever he went, Matilda was there, watching, learning, becoming something no one had expected her to be. A sovereign in her own right. The road to Italy was long, winding through the Alps where peaks cut into the clouds like blades of stone. For most pilgrims and soldiers, the journey was an ordeal of frost, hunger, and aching limbs. But for Matilda, now styled Empress of the Romans, it was also initiation, a passage from the confines of German courts into the theater of Christendom itself. She rode with Henry's army in 1116 as they crossed into Lombardy, banners snapping in the wind, the black eagle of the empire looming above columns of knights and ox-drawn wagons. Behind her, the clang of iron-shod hooves echoed through narrow passes. Before her, the plains of Italy opened like a stage upon which empires collided. Italy was no quiet land. It was a patchwork of rival cities, each jealously guarding its freedoms, each wary of imperial authority. And above them all, the Pope, claiming spiritual dominion over kings and emperors alike. Henry marched south to assert his rights, but he did not march alone. At his side was Matilda, her presence calculated, her image deliberate. She was not simply wife, but symbol, a young empress representing continuity, legitimacy, and God's supposed blessing on imperial power. In Rome, her role expanded. Chroniclers record her presiding over audiences, receiving abbots and bishops, granting petitions in her husband's absence. Imagine her seated in imperial robes beneath the shadow of ancient Roman columns, her voice steady as she affixed her seal to decrees. To those who approached her, she was not a foreign child but the living embodiment of empire. But power in Rome was never secure. Streets boiled with factional unrest, papal envoys conspired against the emperor, mobs swelled with anger at German soldiers occupying their city. Matilda, still barely in her teens, lived within the tension of a capital where daggers could appear as swiftly as blessings. One account notes how she walked in solemn procession through the Lateran, her face composed, her step unwavering as hostile crowds shouted from afar. It is a moment worth pausing on, the transformation of a girl once traded like a pawn into a figure who, even in the heart of danger, carried herself with imperial dignity. Henry's reign in Italy was marked by conflict, but for Matilda it was training. Every negotiation she witnessed, every confrontation with a papal envoy, every oath sworn in her presence taught her the language of authority. These were not lessons found in books, but in the raw theater of power. And yet, beneath the grandeur, one wonders what she felt in the quiet moments. The hush of a Roman chapel lit by candle flames, the solitude of her chamber when the city roared outside. Did she pray for her father's distant realm? Did she dream of escape? Or did she already begin to understand that her destiny was bound not to longing, but to survival, and perhaps one day to rule? For now she was empress in Italy, young but unshaken. And in the years to come, these lessons would steel her for struggles far greater than those of Rome. By the mid-1120s, the brilliance of Henry Vitica's reign had begun to dim. Years of ceaseless campaigns, endless quarrels with the papacy, and the grinding weight of rebellion had left their mark. The once proud emperor who had stormed across the Alps with iron resolve grew pale, weakened, his body failing even as his ambition burned undimmed. Matilda, now in her early 20s, had long since shed the image of the frightened child bride. She was imperatrix, accustomed to the weight of crown and ceremony, fluent in the languages of empire. She had walked through Rome at her husband's side, seen the pride of Lombardy bow, and signed her name on imperial charters. She was no longer an ornament. She was part of the machinery of rule, and yet for all her titles she remained tethered to Henry's fate. In 1125, sickness gripped the emperor. His body wasted, his strength ebbed. Chroniclers describe him carried by litter instead of horse, his breath shallow, his voice rasping with pain. The man who had once bent princes to his will could no longer lift a sword. At his bedside in Utrecht, Matilda stood, not as a weeping widow in waiting, but as a woman who understood that with his death, her place in the empire would dissolve. For Henry and Matilda had no children. No heir bound their bloodline to the crown. And in the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics, that meant her power would vanish the moment his heartbeat ceased. On May 23, 1125, Henry V died. The imperial court dissolved in an instant. Nobles who once bowed before. The Empress turned their thoughts to succession, to rival claimants, to the scramble for power that always followed the fall of a crown. Within days, Matilda's titles were hollow. She was no longer Augusta, no longer the radiant consort of empire. She was a widow, a foreigner, stranded in a realm that no longer needed her. But Henry had left her one gift, his treasury. In his will, Matilda was granted immense wealth. Gold, estates, jewels, a fortune sufficient to command respect even stripped of her crown. It was a recognition, perhaps, of her endurance at his side, or perhaps it was simply the emperor's final calculation, that his young widow, still daughter of a king, might yet prove useful on another stage. For Matilda, the moment was shattering and clarifying. She had entered the empire as a child pawn, had been crowned as a teenage bride, and had stood as empress in Rome. Now she was widowed, 23 years old, and once again subject to the designs of men. But this time, she carried with her the knowledge of courts, of power, of how empires moved. She had been forged in fire, and she was not returning to England as the girl who had left it. She was returning as an empress. In the summer of 1126, the Empress Matilda returned to the land of her birth. 20 years had passed since she had been sent away, a child clutching the hem of her nurse's gown as she boarded a ship to Germany. Now she came back not as pawn, nor bride, nor orphaned widow, but as Domina Imperatrix, the Lady Empress, veiled in black mourning robes and trailed by a retinue of knights, priests, and imperial servants. The ports of Normandy stirred at her arrival. To the people, she was a marvel. The daughter of England, who had once vanished into the far reaches of the empire, now returned crowned, titled, wrapped in the aura of Rome and Germany. Few queens in Europe commanded such prestige at so young an age. Fewer still had endured what she had endured. But beneath the pageantry lay uncertainty. Her father, King Henry I of England, was aging. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had drowned 5 years earlier in the White Ship disaster, leaving the succession in peril. The court whispered of cousins and barons, of rival claimants ready to seize the throne the moment the king's heart failed. England teetered on the edge of chaos, and into this void stepped Matilda. Henry I, shrewd and relentless, recognized her value at once. In her he saw not just a daughter returned, but a solution, an heir to secure his bloodline, to prevent his barons from tearing the realm apart after his death. In a move as bold as it was unprecedented, he declared before his nobles that Matilda, his daughter, his widow of an emperor, was his chosen successor. The barons were summoned. They gathered in solemn assembly, the hall heavy with torchlight and expectation. One by one they swore oaths of fealty to Matilda, their voices echoing through the chamber. It was a spectacle meant to bind loyalty with ritual, to make the unthinkable, rule by a woman, something sanctioned by law and God. But oaths, as history teaches, are fragile things. Many swore with reluctance, their hands on relics but their hearts unbound. They looked upon the Empress with doubt, with unease. A woman on the throne, a foreign widow, was she not still more German than English, more imperial than Angevin? Matilda herself gave little away. She stood calm, austere, her expression unreadable beneath her widow's veil. If she sensed their reluctance, she betrayed no fear. She had seen worse in Rome, had stood unshaken before mobs and bishops alike. These English lords were no different. In that moment she became more than her father's daughter. She became England's heir, yet destiny is never so simple. Even as the ink dried on their oaths, forces gathered in shadow, ambitious barons, rival claimants, and one man above all who would come to define her struggle, Stephen of Blois, her cousin. For now, though, Matilda stood ascendant. The little girl pawn, the child bride, the widow of an emperor, had returned to the game. And this time, she intended to play for a crown. It was December 1135 when the news spread across Normandy like wildfire. King Henry I was dead. The old lion, who had outlived rivals, rebellions, and even his own son, had finally succumbed to a sudden illness after feasting on lampreys. His passing left a kingdom in peril. The barons had sworn years before to uphold Matilda's claim. She was the chosen heir, the anointed successor. But in the cold reality of medieval politics, words were brittle things. Many lords balked at the thought of kneeling to a woman, even an empress. Others feared that her ties to the German Empire and her looming remarriage into the Angevin house would bring foreign domination to English soil. Into this hesitation stepped her cousin, Stephen of Blois. Charming, affable, with a soldier's bearing and a politician's instinct, Stephen moved swiftly. While Matilda lingered in Normandy, calculating her next step, Stephen crossed the Channel. In London, he was greeted not with suspicion, but with open arms. For the city's merchants and guildsmen, a male king promised stability. For the church, Stephen promised favor and concessions. For ambitious nobles, he promised rewards. Within weeks, Stephen was crowned King of England. The coronation bells rang out over Westminster, and with them, Matilda's inheritance was stolen. Her fury, though silent, was volcanic. She had been betrayed, not just by Stephen, but by the very barons who had sworn their loyalty on sacred relics. She had been humiliated, dismissed as a woman too weak to rule. But Matilda was no fragile pawn anymore. She was an empress, and she would not accept this theft quietly. The years that followed would be remembered as the Anarchy. England became a battlefield, its fields scarred by marching armies, its villages burned by opportunistic lords who switched sides as easily as cloaks in the wind. The chronicler William of Malmesbury described it with chilling simplicity. Christ and his saints slept. Families starved as harvests failed. Castles rose like thorns across the countryside, each one a nest of soldiers preying upon the land. The law was whatever the strongest lord decreed. And in the heart of it all stood two rivals locked in bitter struggle. Stephen, the usurper crowned by speed and cunning, and Matilda, the rightful heir, her claim burning in her veins like fire. Her fight for the crown had begun. Even before her father's death, Henry I had pressed his daughter into another marriage. Widowed young, Matilda might have sought solace in her imperial title, but dynastic politics allowed no pause for grief. In 1128 she was wed again, this time to Geoffrey, Count of Anjou. It was a union that shocked many. Geoffrey was just 15, a boy not yet tempered by war or politics, while Matilda at 26 was already an empress, hardened by imperial courts and the bitter lessons of widowhood. Their age difference became the subject of mocking whispers. What could such a youth offer the seasoned widow of the Holy Roman Emperor? But beneath the laughter there was strategy. Geoffrey, heir to the Angevin house, commanded lands stretching across the Loire Valley, rich and restless, a region long at odds with Normandy. For Henry I, this marriage was not about love, it was about survival. By binding Matilda to Anjou, he hoped to secure a powerful alliance that would anchor his dynasty against rebellious barons and French encroachment. The marriage itself was uneasy from the start. Matilda, proud and used to command, bristled at Geoffrey's immaturity. Geoffrey, fiery-tempered and ambitious, resented being overshadowed by a wife whose rank eclipsed his own. Their quarrels were notorious, and more than once she threatened to leave him. Chroniclers even recorded that she fled her husband's court in the early years, refusing to return until Henry I himself intervened. Yet, in time, something remarkable emerged from their stormy union: children. Henry Roman II, the firstborn, arrived in 1133, followed by Geoffrey and William. These sons would become Matilda's strongest hand in the gamble for England's throne. For in an age where legitimacy was everything, her ability to produce heirs silenced whispers of barrenness and strengthened her claim immeasurably. While Stephen tightened his grip on England, Matilda and Geoffrey built their power in Normandy and Anjou. Castles rose along the borders, coins were struck in their name, and their marriage, once scorned, became the cornerstone of a dynasty. Geoffrey himself, once dismissed as a hot-headed youth, proved a skilled commander. His campaigns in Normandy weakened Stephen's allies and secured Matilda a foothold for her eventual return. Still, behind the stone walls and diplomatic victories, the marriage never softened into tenderness. Matilda and Geoffrey were partners in ambition, not lovers in harmony. Their bond was forged in necessity, tempered by quarrels but sustained by the weight of their shared purpose: to carve a future where their children would rule not just Anjou, but all of England. And for Matilda, every night of unrest, every bitter word exchanged, was worth enduring for that greater prize: The crown she still believed was hers by right. By 1139, the fragile truce between Matilda and Stephen had shattered. Her cousin's reign was faltering, plagued by baronial unrest, rebellions in Normandy, and whispers of betrayal within his own court. For Matilda, it was the moment she had been waiting for. That year she crossed the Channel. No longer the young empress exiled in Normandy, but a hardened claimant flanked by loyal allies. Chief among them was her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, a man whose military brilliance would prove indispensable. With him rode a cotter of knights and mercenaries, men lured by gold, loyalty, or the promise of plunder. Their landing was not grand, not the sweeping conquest of William the Conqueror 70 years before. It was quiet, almost furtive, a handful of ships stealing onto the southern coast. Yet from these modest beginnings, a war would rage that would tear England apart for nearly 2 decades. The early years were marked by skirmishes and sieges, by shifting loyalties and bitter attrition. Castles became the true prizes of war, stone fortresses from which lords could command the countryside, tax peasants, and project power. Stephen, ever restless, dashed from stronghold to stronghold, quelling uprisings with sword in hand. Matilda, meanwhile, secured footholds in the west, her banners rising over the strongholds of her supporters. It was not a war of sweeping battles, it was a war of endurance. Famine stalked the villages, trade faltered, and peasants bore the heaviest burden. Chroniclers described fields left untilled, churches desecrated, and whole regions reduced to wilderness by marauding soldiers. Yet Matilda pressed on. Her claim was no longer just words carried by envoys. It was an army, a court in exile, a rival government rooted in defiance. She was determined to prove not only that she had the right to rule, but that she had the strength to claim it. And in 1141, fate delivered her the chance she had waited for. Stephen himself was captured at the Battle of Lincoln. The throne of England seemed, at last, within her grasp. The year was 1141. The Battle of Lincoln had turned the tide. Stephen, the usurper king, was in chains, hauled off the battlefield and dragged into captivity. For Matilda, it was a moment of dazzling triumph. The crown of England, denied to her for 6 bitter years, now seemed hers to seize. With Stephen imprisoned, she marched toward London, her court swelling with new allies who flocked to her side. Chroniclers wrote of her entering the city not as a fugitive, but as a queen in waiting. The bells of St. Paul's tolled, and for the first time England looked ready to accept Empress Matilda as its rightful sovereign. But triumph has a way of breeding resentment. In the eyes of her enemies, and even some of her supporters, Matilda's greatest flaw was not her birthright, but her demeanor. She was proud, unbending, imperious. Where Stephen charmed with easy smiles, Matilda demanded obedience. Where he forgave, she demanded repayment. London's merchants, who had welcomed her with open gates, soon found her demands for money heavy-handed. The church, whose blessing she required for coronation, bristled at her lack of deference. Even allies like Bishop Henry of Winchester, the king's own brother, wavered, their loyalty cracking under the weight of her severity. The breaking point came in the summer of 1141. As Matilda prepared for her coronation at Westminster, unrest boiled over. A mob rose in the streets of London, their shouts echoing against the stone walls. "Away with the Empress! We want no queen but a king!" Matilda was forced to flee, her coronation abandoned, her triumph undone. Within weeks, Stephen's supporters rallied. His queen, the formidable Matilda of Boulogne, mustered armies in his name. And though the Empress still held the king prisoner, her grip on England had slipped through her fingers. It was one of the cruelest turns in medieval history. Matilda, so close to the crown she had been promised, saw it ripped away by fear, politics, and her own uncompromising will. The war, far from ending, had only deepened. The anarchy would grind on, a weary struggle of betrayal, famine, and fire. And the woman who had once been poised to rule England as queen now stood once more as an exile, hunted, defiant, and unbroken. After the disaster in London, the war entered a grinding, merciless phase. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could secure a decisive victory, and so England became trapped in a twilight of endless conflict. Stephen, freed from captivity later in 1141 through a prisoner exchange, clawed back his crown with the same restless energy that had won him the throne years earlier. Matilda, though still commanding loyal lords and her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, found her momentum slowing. Armies marched, castles were besieged, treaties were signed and broken, all with little lasting result. For the people of England, these years were remembered as a nightmare. Chroniclers wrote of villages reduced to ashes, of peasants stripped of their harvests, of lawless mercenaries roaming like wolves across the countryside. Castles, once symbols of lordly power, multiplied like weeds, each one a stronghold for extortion, as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded in despair. They built castles and filled them with devils and evil men. Then they captured all who they supposed had any wealth. Men said openly that Christ and his saints slept. It was not a war of glorious battles, but of slow ruin. Roads became unsafe, trade withered, famine struck. In some regions, entire communities fled, abandoning fields to brambles and beasts. The kingdom that Henry I had forged into order was dissolving into anarchy. And yet Matilda endured. From her stronghold in the west, she remained a rallying figure for her supporters. Her sons, growing in Anjou under the tutelage of Geoffrey, represented not only her cause but the promise of a dynasty. Henry, her eldest, showed early signs of the iron will that would one day shape him into one of England's greatest kings. But in the 1140s, that future was still uncertain. The war was a stalemate, neither side strong enough to crush the other, neither side weak enough to collapse. Stephen sat uneasy on the throne. Matilda held her ground in defiance, and England bled in the shadow of their struggle. By the mid-1140s, the endless war had dulled into a grim rhythm. Stephen ruled, but without security. Matilda resisted, but without triumph. It seemed England might bleed forever. But in Normandy and Anjou, a new figure was rising, the boy who would one day change everything. Henry, the eldest son of Matilda and Geoffrey of Anjou, was no ordinary child. From the moment of his birth in 1133, his destiny had been tied to crowns. While his mother fought and schemed in England, Henry was raised in the turbulent courts of Anjou, where politics were as sharp as any sword. Geoffrey drilled him in war, training him to ride, fight, and command, while Matilda instilled in him the iron conviction that England was his by right. By his early teens, Henry already displayed a precocious will. Chroniclers describe him as bold to the point of recklessness, brimming with energy, and unafraid to challenge men twice his age. He had the Angevin fire of his father, but also the steel of his mother, a combination that made him magnetic to allies and dangerous to enemies. In 1147, when he was just 14, Henry made his first daring attempt to claim his inheritance. Against all advice, he crossed the Channel with a band of mercenaries, landing in England to join the war. He lacked money, supplies, and a clear plan, but what he did possess was audacity. Even when the expedition faltered, his sheer determination impressed those who met him. The boy had come not as a supplicant, but as a prince demanding his birthright. Though his first foray ended in little more than a skirmish, it marked the beginning of his active role in the struggle. No longer was the war only about Matilda versus Stephen. It was now about the future of Henry himself. And as the 1150s dawned, Henry's star only rose higher. He inherited Normandy through his mother's rights, Anjou through his father's legacy, and soon secured Aquitaine by marrying Eleanor, the most powerful heiress in Europe. The pieces of empire were gathering. The long stalemate in England would not last forever. A new force had entered the game, and his name was Henry Plantagenet. By the early 1150s, the anarchy had dragged on for nearly 2 decades. Neither Stephen nor Matilda could claim outright victory. Both were scarred by years of conflict, and England itself was exhausted. Stephen, once vigorous and bold, was aging. His reign, though still standing, had been hollowed by endless rebellions and the erosion of royal authority. Matilda, too, was no longer the central figure of the war. Her role had shifted to that of strategist and mother, working behind the scenes to advance the fortunes of her son Henry, whose growing power now overshadowed them all. Henry Plantagenet had become a force impossible to ignore. By 1153, he controlled vast lands, Normandy, Anjou, and through his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, much of southern France. His dominions stretched farther than any English king before him. When Henry landed in England with a seasoned army, it was clear. This was no longer a boy's adventure, but a man's claim to a crown. The war could have ended in a cataclysm, but fate intervened. That summer at Wallingford, the two sides met for what might have been a decisive battle. Yet instead of bloodshed, exhaustion prevailed. Both armies, weary and unwilling to fight, hesitated. Leaders on both sides urged compromise. And so came the Treaty of Wallingford in 1153. Its terms were simple yet monumental. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but upon his death, the crown would pass not to his own son, but to Henry. It was not a total victory for Matilda, but it was a vindication. Her relentless struggle, her endurance through betrayal, exile, and defeat had secured the throne for her bloodline. England would not have a queen named Matilda, but it would have a king forged by her will. In October 1154, Stephen died. True to the treaty, Henry ascended the throne as Henry Roman II, first of the Plantagenets, founder of a dynasty that would rule England for centuries. And though Matilda never wore the crown herself, she was the architect of its future. In her, England had nearly gained its first queen regnant. In her son, it gained a king whose empire would stretch from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. The anarchy had ended. The dynasty had begun. When the dust of the anarchy finally settled, Matilda withdrew from the battlefield. She returned to Normandy, no longer a claimant in arms, but a matriarch guiding her son's reign from afar. There she played a quieter but no less vital role, advising Henry Roman II, corresponding with bishops and nobles, and shaping the governance of his sprawling empire. She never wore the crown she had been promised. History remembers her not as Queen of England, but as Empress Matilda, a title she carried with unyielding pride until her death in 1167. And yet, her absence from the coronation chair does not diminish her legacy. Without her iron will, her resilience through betrayal, and her refusal to be erased, the Plantagenet dynasty would never have risen. Matilda's story is one of paradox. She was too proud for some, too uncompromising for others, but it was precisely those qualities that secured her family's future. Where others bent, she held firm. Where others abandoned hope, she endured. And in the end, it was her bloodline that transformed England. Through Henry Roman II, her legacy stretched to Richard the Lionheart, to King John and Magna Carta, to the long Plantagenet age that defined medieval England. Every monarch of that line carried her shadow. The chroniclers, often critical of her sharp temper and unyielding nature, nevertheless acknowledged her greatness. In an age when a woman on the throne was unthinkable, Matilda forced the question, and in forcing it, she changed the course of English history. She was a woman who lost her crown, yet won a dynasty, an empress who never ruled, yet shaped kings. And though her name is sometimes forgotten beside those of her famous descendants, the truth remains. Without Matilda, there would have been no Plantagenet empire. Her story is not of defeat, but of endurance, not of failure, but of foundation. The first queen who might have been, the empress who gave England its kings.